The air in the interrogation room was thick with tension, the overhead light casting sharp shadows on the cracked grey walls. David Assay sat hunched in the metal chair, his hands trembling on the scarred table before him. The fake Ghanaian passport lay there like a cursed horn, exposed and damning. Across from him, the immigration officer, a woman with a face carved from stone, stared at him with detached precision. "Why did you do it, Mr. Osei?" Her voice was calm, sterile. "Do you know the penalty for passport forgery in this country?" David didn't answer at first. His breath was shallow, chest rising and falling in tight rhythm. Slowly, he looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with sleeplessness and something deeper regret, desperation, maybe both, because it was the only way to save her. He said, voice hoarse but unwavering. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to shrink. Then, with a sharp cut, the image changed. Bright hospital lights flickering above sterile ceilings, the mechanical whirl of gurney wheels echoing down a corridor. Aisha Adenyi, 27, unconscious and ghostly pale, was being rushed through the hallway, her body limp beneath a blanket, her skin slick with cold sweat. Tubes trailed from her arms, monitors beeped in warning tones, and nurses barked orders as they pushed forward. David's voice lingered, bleeding into the scene like a confession. Sometimes saving a life costs more than prison time. Back in the interrogation room, the officer didn't move. Her pen hovered over a form, ready to mark down another name, another charge. But David was no longer looking at her. His eyes stared through the table, through the walls, to the moment he knew everything would change. That torn passport hadn't started as a crime, it had started as a promise, one he couldn't afford to break. David Assay never imagined his journey would bring him to an interrogation room under the cold gaze of the law. Born and raised in Kumasi, Ghana, he grew up surrounded by the quiet resilience of a family that lived on modest means but held boundless dreams for their children. He was the first in his family to cross borders for higher education. A scholarship to a medical university in Nigeria had changed everything. Driven by purpose and burdened with the quiet pressure of expectation, David balanced long hours at the university hospital with late shifts at a local pharmacy to make ends meet. He lived frugally, studied tirelessly, and held tightly to the idea that one day he would wear a white coat, not just as a symbol, but as proof that he had done something meaningful. It was at the teaching hospital in Lagos that he met Aisha Adenyi. She was unlike anyone David had ever encountered, sharp, outspoken, and brilliantly defiant in a world that tried to tame women like her. As a Nigerian American with dual citizenship, Aisha had options David could only dream of, yet she never wore her privilege like armor. Instead, she fought her battles alongside him, arguing with supervisors, advocating for patients, and never letting anyone tell her what she couldn't do. Their bond formed quickly and quietly, rooted in late-night shifts, shared meals snatched in hospital corridors, and long conversations that revealed a mutual hunger for justice, for purpose, for something bigger than either of them. But behind Aisha's confident exterior was a secret she had only shared with David once their friendship had deepened into something more fragile and real. She suffered from a rare genetic blood disorder, one that required advanced treatment and monitoring treatment, available only in a few specialized centers in the United States. It was a condition that could stay dormant for months, but, when triggered, could spiral into a life-threatening crisis. She managed it carefully, avoided stress when she could, and kept emergency meds on her at all times. But when it flared, She was vulnerable in a way that terrified her more than she liked to admit. The crisis came suddenly. Aisha had skipped a dose during a brutal week of night shifts, then missed another when the hospital ran out of stock. By the time she collapsed in her dorm room, it was already too late for local care. The teaching hospital lacked the necessary equipment, and Lagos, for all its chaos and brilliance, wasn't prepared for a case like hers. She needed to be evacuated to the US immediately, but bureaucracy, as always, was merciless. Her American insurance refused to authorize an airlift for a non-spouse companion. Her parents, living abroad and long estranged, were unreachable, both emotionally and literally. Worse still, her American passport, her only ticket out, was locked away at her ex-boyfriend's house. A toxic history kept her from retrieving it, and when David tried, the ex flatly refused to help. David watched her fade. Day by day, her strength withered, her lips paled, and the fire in her voice flickered. The hospital did what it could, but everyone knew it wasn't enough. So David made a decision, one he never thought he'd make. He knew a guy, a regular at the pharmacy, who worked in documents, a fixer, dangerous, shady, but fast. For the right price, he could get a forged passport, a believable one, that could get David on a flight to the US with Aisha. He sold everything he had saved. He cashed out his tuition fund, and he prayed the papers would hold long enough to get her. On that plane, she was dying, and there was no other way. What started as a desperate act of love turned into a federal crime. By the time immigration agents flagged the forgery during a layover, Aisha was already in critical care, unconscious, and connected to machines that might give her a chance. David, however, was pulled aside, separated from her, and taken into custody. He didn't resist, he didn't lie. He simply told the truth, that he had broken the law to save the woman he loved, and that if given the choice again, he would do it all over. The hospital room was a blur of wires, machines, and the dull, continuous beeping that tracked the fading rhythm of Aisha's heart. Her skin had turned a sickly grey, her breathing shallow and erratic. Doctors circled, whispering in tense tones. But David already knew what they weren't saying aloud. She wouldn't survive another 48 hours. The medication had done all it could. Her body was shutting down. They needed to get her out, now. Desperation flooded David's chest like fire. He had already tried everything, called embassies, appealed to her insurance, begged administrators to make an exception, but no one moved. She wasn't married. He was just a friend, not immediate family. No authorization, no medevac, just bureaucracy, policies, and cold procedural silence. And Aisha, unconscious, slipping further away. It was then he knew there was no more waiting, no more calls, only action. He reached out to a man he had met months ago, shadowy figure who frequented the pharmacy after hours, dealing in whispers and favors. The man had offered once, half joking, to fix papers fast. David had said no at the time, but now he didn't hesitate. They met behind a shuttered storefront under the cover of night. The man made one demand: cash up front and complete silence. No questions, no delays. In return, David would get a forged Ghanaian passport stamped with US marriage recognition, complete with a false marriage certificate showing him as Aisha Adni's husband. David handed over everything he had left. The agent worked fast. By morning, the documents were in his hands, gleaming with false legitimacy. David didn't look at them long. He just went straight to the hospital, contacted the American medevac team, and presented the papers. This time, The clearance came through. There were no questions, just fast arrangements. Within hours, Aisha was being prepped for emergency. Airlift. David stayed by her side, not as a friend, but as a husband and paper, at least. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted off from Lagos, David sat gripping her cold hand, whispering to her through the drone of the flight, begging her to hold on just a little longer. They landed in New York just past dawn. The sun was rising over the skyline as the medics rushed Aisha into a waiting ambulance. Her condition still critical but stable enough for transfer. For a moment, David allowed himself to breathe. They had made it. She was alive. She had a chance, but the moment didn't last. At passport control, a red flag blinked on the agent's screen. The forged document trushed, brilliant but imperfect, had tripped a security protocol. 2 officers appeared at David's side. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply turned to watch the ambulance vanish down the road, sirens wailing. Into the distance. "Sir, you'll need to come with us." He nodded. His voice cracked as he turned to one of the officers, eyes hollow from sleeplessness and fear. "Please," he whispered, not for himself, not for mercy, just let her live. They cuffed him without force. He didn't struggle. The only fight left in him had already been spent in getting her this far. The walls of the immigration detention cell were bare and colorless, the air sharp with antiseptic and silence. David sat on the narrow cot, knees pressed together, hands clasped tightly, as if praying, but no words came anymore, just the weight of consequences pressing in from all sides. Beyond the reinforced doors and glass, Aisha lay in a New York ICU, her fragile life suspended in the space between recovery and collapse. He had gotten her here but now he was the one running out of time. A government-appointed lawyer, young and overworked, shuffled in with files tucked under one arm and a tired look in his eyes. "They're considering deportation," he said bluntly, no room for preamble. "Possession and use of forged documents. Immigration fraud. You could face a 10-year ban from re-entering the US, plus a criminal record that follows you wherever you go. If you're lucky, you'll be sent back. If you're not," the words trailed off, unspoken. David didn't flinch. He had already. Imagined worse. The lawyer leaned forward, voice softening. "There is a way to reduce the charges. You just have to say you were coerced, that someone forced you into doing this, that it wasn't personal, that you were manipulated." He hesitated. "They'll go easier if you say it wasn't about her." David looked up slowly. His eyes were dark, sleepless, but fierce with something unmovable. "I love her," he said simply. "That's not something I'll erase to protect myself." The lawyer exhaled, defeated. "Then they'll come at you harder." But David didn't care, because what else was left if he rewrote the truth just to stay clean on paper? He had grown up with too many sacrifices made in silence to sell his own. For comfort, he thought of his mother back in Kumasi, waking before dawn each day to work the fields, her fingers cracked and raw from years of labor. He remembered her prayers, murmured over steaming pots of rice, over his suitcase the night he left for Nigeria, her hope stitched into every corner of his life. His education wasn't just his. It belonged to her, to his family, to every sleepless night and unpaid bill back home. They had given everything so he could dream. And now that dream hung by a thread of forged paper and an act of love. Meanwhile, across the city, Aisha opened her eyes in a sterile room filled with machines and tubes. For a moment, The world was blurred white walls, soft beeping, the echo of her own breath, but clarity came quickly. A nurse smiled gently and told her she had made it, that she was safe, that someone had fought for her. The words barely registered, until she saw the news report playing silently on the mounted TV. Ghanaian student arrested for immigration fraud in attempt to evacuate critically ill woman. David, the realization hit her harder than the illness had. She demanded answers. Nurses gave her cautious fragments. The doctor said he had traveled with her on a medevac flight using a forged passport. The words fell into her chest like stones. When she was strong enough, she insisted on seeing him. The visitation room in the detention center was sterile and heavy with unspoken words. She entered in a wheelchair, her face still pale but her eyes burning with emotion. David stood the moment he saw her. She looked thinner, tired, but alive. His chest tightened at the sight. "You forged your passport?" she asked, voice shaking. He nodded, silent. "For me?" she demanded. He stepped closer, hands open, as if that gesture could soften the weight of it. "I had no other way, Aisha. You were dying. No one would help. I couldn't just watch." She blinked rapidly, her breath uneven. "You could go to prison. For me, David, that's not something people just do." "I did it," he said quietly, "because I couldn't lose you. I didn't even think. I just ... I had to get you out." Her jaw clenched. "You saved me, but you may have destroyed your own life. How do I live with that?" The silence between them grew sharp. Her words weren't angry, they were cracked with something deeper. Guilt, love, fear tangled into one unbearable knot. He had risked everything, his future, his freedom, not for some heroic ideal, but for her. And now she had to carry that weight, knowing he might be deported, imprisoned, cut off from everything he had worked for. "I didn't ask you to do this," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "but I'd do it again." They sat in silence. For a long time, divided by the glass and the system, two people tied together by a love that had become both salvation and sentence. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that stretches time and sharpens every breath. David stood at the defense table, hands clasped in front of him, wearing a plain suit borrowed from a detention center charity bin. His voice was steady but quiet as he entered his plea, guilty. He made no excuses, offered no justification beyond the truth that had guided him all along. He loved Aisha. He had acted alone. He had broken the law not for gain, but because the system had closed every other door. The prosecution pushed for a sentence, months in federal prison, followed by deportation. The judge, a stern woman with tired eyes, took notes without expression. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned. Aisha entered slowly, leaning heavily on crutches, her face pale but resolute. She hadn't been expected. Her doctors had advised against the trip, but here she was, standing on fragile legs, determined. The room held its breath as she made her way to the front, each step a quiet defiance of everything that had nearly taken her life. When she spoke, her voice trembled at first, then strengthened with each word. "Your Honor, I wouldn't be alive today if David Essay hadn't done what he did. He didn't act out of malice or greed. He wasn't smuggling drugs or committing fraud for profit. He was trying to save me because our system failed, because no one would help, because my own country wouldn't recognize his role in my life unless we had a piece of paper saying we were married. But his love, his sacrifice, was more real than anything on paper. The courtroom fell silent. Even the prosecution hesitated. Journalist in the back caught it all. The next morning, headlines blazed. Asterisk man risks prison to save the woman he loves. A video clip of Aisha's testimony spread across social media like wildfire. Hashtag Let David Stay trended within hours. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Celebrities reposted the story. Human rights organizations weighed in. Petition signatures soared into the hundreds of thousands. What had started as a quiet, tragic case of immigration violation became a global love story, a challenge to policy, a call for change. The judge took a long pause before delivering her verdict. She acknowledged that the law had been broken and that justice had to be served. But she also recognized something rare in act, driven not by selfishness, but by selflessness, an extraordinary set of circumstances. The courtroom fell silent as she read the decision aloud. No prison time. Mandatory community service, to be completed under supervision in Ghana. Immediate deportation, effective within the week. David's knees nearly buckled. He turned to Aisha as the ruling settled like dust over them both. There was no sentence hanging over his head now, but he was still being taken from her. He would not finish his degree. He would not walk across the stage in a white coat. He would be returned to Kumasi with no guarantee of ever stepping foot in the US again. For a long second, they just stared at each other, unable to speak. Then Aisha stepped forward, crutches, trembling, and threw her arms around him. They held each other tightly, fiercely, like the world might fall apart the moment they let go. Her voice broke against his shoulder. "You saved my life," she whispered. "Now I swear I'll find a way to bring you back." Tears streamed down David's face as he nodded, unable to say anything through the weight in his chest. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved her. But at a cost neither of them had truly understood until now. The red dust of Kumasi clung to David's shoes as he stepped out of the bus and took in the familiar horizon, the low, rust-streaked roofs, the smell of firewood and mango, and the steady hum of life that never seemed to pause, even for sorrow. He was home, though it didn't feel like it, not completely. The sting of what he'd lost, his degree, his future in medicine, and Aisha still clung to him. Yet he was not broken. Sadness had taken root, yes, but so had something sturdier. Resolve. Within weeks, David found work with a small clinic on the outskirts of Kumasi, one barely held together by a dedicated doctor to aging nurses and a single solar-powered refrigerator for vaccines. They couldn't pay him, not really, but he didn't care. He volunteered his time, helping diagnose common illnesses, translating prescriptions, and eventually training local nurses in basic emergency procedures. Without a license, he couldn't do surgeries or formally practice. But that didn't stop him from becoming the steady, knowledgeable presence the village had lacked for years. Mothers brought their children to him. Grandmothers sought his advice. In the dim light of kerosene lamps, he rediscovered a kind of medicine that didn't need permission to matter. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Aisha fought through her own healing. The treatments had worked. Her body regained its strength, and so did her voice, fueled by guilt, gratitude, and purpose. She poured herself into something new, a non-profit built from the very cracks in the system that had nearly killed her. She called it Second Wind. The mission was simple: provide emergency support and legal aid to African patients needing medical evacuation and facing cross-border red tape. She rallied doctors, lawyers, donors, What began as a one-room office above a Bronx pharmacy soon grew into a team that changed real lives. But behind every press release and successful case, her thoughts always circled back to one name, David. 2 years passed. She never gave up on his case. Lawyers had tried and failed until one afternoon. A junior immigration attorney with a specialty in humanitarian law agreed to take another look. Buried in the files, she found a technicality. Because David had been authorized to enter U.S. airspace under emergency medevac circumstances, and because he had been listed as next of kin by the medical team if falsely there existed a procedural loophole. It was thin, fragile, and entirely dependent on advocacy. But it was something. Aisha flew to D.C. to speak before a committee. She wrote letters. She called in favors. Her foundation's growing network of supporters amplified the cause, and suddenly, what had once been dismissed as a closed case reopened like a long-sealed door creaking on old hinges. Hope, long dormant in David's heart, stirred again, not because of a miracle, but because someone believed enough to keep fighting. The sliding doors of JFK hissed open as David stepped into the arrivals hall, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. He moved slowly, his frame thinner, his face marked by time, by waiting, by the quiet ache of years spent wondering if this moment would ever come. The sounds of reunions swirled around him, laughter, suitcases rolling, names being called, but he barely heard them. His eyes scanned the crowd, unsure, hesitant, searching. Then he saw her. Aisha sat just beyond the crowd, in a wheelchair, her body still healing, but her spirit unmistakably alive. Her hair was shorter, her cheeks fuller, and in her lap rested a cardboard sign scrawled in thick black letters. Asterisk, welcome. Back, husband. Asterisk, when their eyes met, the weight of 2 years seemed to lift all at once, replaced by the stunned stillness of something too good to believe. She didn't wave, he didn't run. They just looked at each other, holding that space as if afraid it might vanish. And then, as if on instinct, David dropped his bag and walked to her. No words, no questions, just arms around arms, foreheads pressed close, and a silence that said everything they hadn't been able to say across borders and time zones. Around them, the world went on, but inside that embrace, it paused. From somewhere unseen, a voice carried through like breath over still water. Asterisk, some love stories don't end. They go away, and they find their way back.